Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar. As it says here, we're here to talk to you about the future approach to quality regulation. I'm Jess Bacon. I'm one of the managers in the TEF team, joined by my colleagues Graham and Catherine today, but they'll introduce themselves when I pass over to them. Just going to talk a bit about who we are as the OfS. I'm sure most of you have worked with us in one way or another before, but also it's helpful probably to start slow as more people join. So we're the regulator for higher education in England. Lots of different institutions register with us because they want to access benefits in English higher education. So we work with universities, colleges, lots of small and specialist providers. We set requirements that institutions have to meet around different areas. So teaching quality, student outcomes, access and participation, management and governance, financial sustainability, just to name a few areas. And today we're here to talk to you about sort of quality and student outcomes in particular. So as you're hopefully aware, we recently published proposals on our future approach to quality regulation, probably a few weeks ago now. So the purpose of this session is to give you a bit more information around those proposals and to give you sort of time and space to ask your initial questions. This is a session aimed at providers that haven't taken part in TEF before. So the content is very much sort of pitched at that audience. So I think we might have some attendees that have come along that have taken part before, possibly because it's a better time for you, which is fine. But just bear in mind the content was kind of pitched at people that haven't taken part before. So as I said, it's more of an information sharing session. We're not sort of proposing we'll collect formal feedback through this event. There will be some more events aimed at that purpose later on in November, and we'll talk to you a bit more about them at the end. So just to touch on some housekeeping for the session. The chat is turned off and we won't be using the raise hand function. And that's just because it's a really busy session today. We've got lots of attendees. So the way you can ask questions is by using the Q&A box at the top. You can also vote for questions through that. So if question that you think's really interesting and you'd really like to hear the answer to, you can vote for that and please use that because it'll help us prioritize the questions. We might get quite a lot and we might not be able to get through all of them, but obviously we'll do our best. And with that in mind, we might kind of group the questions into themes as well. If there's sort of quicker questions that colleagues can answer, they'll do so as we go along in the chat. So you can pop a question in the Q&A at any point during the session as well. We might ask you to explain your question in the sort of comment that's attached to the Q&A box if we're unclear. So just, try and ask it as clearly as possible. A couple more points. We can't answer questions about individual institutions in particular or, individual assessments and so on. So if you've got anything like that, you can contact us separately at our email address. Again, we'll flash that up at the end. And if we run out of time and we didn't answer your question, you want to follow up with that email address as well. We are recording the session today and that will be available on our website later on. So we will, OfS staff will chair the Q&A session and pass your questions on to colleagues and we'll read the question out, but we won't read names out. And if you have any technical difficulties during the session, you can email our events team, which is at events@officeforstudents.org.uk. You can also access closed captions for the session if you wish to. So that's with the More button at the top of the screen with the 3 dots. And then you can use that to turn on live captions. And finally, we will be sharing a really short feedback questionnaire at the end. So that's just so you can give us really quick thoughts on the session today. Otherwise, I think that is it for housekeeping. And I'm going to hand over to Graham.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Graham. I look after the Teaching Excellence Framework, the TEF, and student outcomes. and I've been involved in running the TEF since it started back in about 2016. If we could move on to the first slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and the overall aims of our proposals for the future approach, and then I'll pass on to colleagues who will talk us through the proposals themselves. So Jess mentioned that we regulate many areas, and we're focusing particularly on how we regulate quality. Our main overall aim is that we want to ensure through our regulation that students from all backgrounds benefit from high quality education. We set out our expectations or requirements for quality in what we call the B conditions of registration. And what you can see here is a very, very short summary of the B conditions for quality. And of course, all providers registered with the Office for Students are subject to those conditions and are expected to meet them. So in very short summary, condition B1 is about course design and content and delivery. B4 is about assessment. Sorry, not going in order here. Condition B2 is about academic support and resources that students need to succeed, and about engagement with students. And condition B3 is about student outcomes, so positive outcomes that students have through completing their studies and then going on to jobs or further study afterwards. So that's a quick summary of our sort of minimum requirements for quality that all providers are subject to. If we can move on to the next slide. The way we assess quality and hold providers to account for providing high quality is currently through two main types of assessment. Firstly, we carry out some targeted deep dive assessments if we've got particular concerns about a university or college not meeting those minimum requirements. And we have carried out a number of those targeted assessments on those various B conditions, and you can find all the published reports on our website. And then secondly, to drive improvement and to recognise and reward excellence, we run the Teaching Excellence Framework, the TEF. And we last did that in 2023. It was mandatory for all providers that had more than 500 undergrad students, and it was voluntary for providers that had fewer than 500. And the session today is really aimed at those that have had fewer than 500 students and decided not to take part in the 2023 TEF. So we will, if we can move on to the next slide, we will talk about the implications for sort of coming into the TEF for the first time through this presentation. So a little bit more background. So why are we changing that approach that I've just described? Well, firstly, we had a review of the Office for Students. It was commissioned by the government, a public bodies review, which is a pretty standard process for public organisations. And the review reported last year. The review team went out and spoke to lots of institutions, to students and to stakeholders, and came up with a series of recommendations about how the Office for Students could improve the way we work. In relation to quality, the review made a number of recommendations. It supported the idea that one of the really important, or one of the most important things we do is to regulate quality in the interest of students. But we should focus more on driving continuous improvement across the whole sector. And the implication there is that our quality assessment should apply to all institutions that register with us. So question the idea that there is voluntary participation in TEF. The review also recommended we develop a more integrated approach. So those two types of assessment I was talking about earlier were quite separate and distinct, and the connections between them weren't entirely clear. So the review recommended we integrate our approach more. And that should provide a much clearer view to students about the level of quality offered by different institutions. So Following that public bodies review, we went out and we spoke to a lot of stakeholders, to sector groups, student groups, and developed various ideas. We kicked around quite a few different ideas, and what we've done recently is published a set of proposals for the future approach. Now, it is a first stage consultation. We're proposing the overall scope and structure of the future system. We do plan a second consultation next year that will go into more detail about the methodology and the guidance and the data and so on. Next slide, please. So with these proposals and the changes that we're proposing, what is it that we're trying to improve on? Well, it's four things, as you can see on the slide. So we want to extend the reach of our assessment to cover all providers. We also, over time, want to move beyond undergraduate students and also include postgraduates in our assessments. We want to improve the impact of our assessment activities. So we have evaluated the 2023 TEF and some of our other assessments, and we have found that they have been positive in encouraging improvement and enhancement. But there is more to do. The effect has been a little bit patchy so far, so we want to have stronger incentives from the TEF in particular to drive improvement across the sector. I've already mentioned that we want a more integrated approach, a more coherent system that colleagues will talk about in a bit more detail shortly. And finally, a more responsive system. So the TEF up to now has run, well, the idea was that it would run once every 4 years. However, we know that things can change within a 4-year period, and we want a system that's more dynamic and agile and can respond more rapidly if changes occur in an institution, rather than having to wait until the next 4-year cycle. Next slide, please. So before we move on to talk about the proposals themselves, I'll just give a very quick overview of how the TEF works, or how it's worked to date, and some of these key elements of the TEF we're proposing to keep the same in future. So not everything is changing. These things we propose will stay the same. So firstly, it's a desk-based assessment. We use evidence from national data sets that we have. We construct indicators. We publish them and share them, obviously, with providers. So we use the data, and then we invite providers to make a submission, and we invite the students to providers to make a submission as well. And those three sources of evidence form the basis of the assessment. The assessment's carried out by experts from the sector. Academics and students from the sector carry out the assessments, and they determine ratings. The rating is given to the provider, so it's a whole provider rating. Even though we do look at different subjects and different student groups within the provider, all of that contributes to the single rating. Throughout the assessment, context is taken into account. It's a very diverse sector, so that the data is all benchmarked to take account of context. We'll explain what that means shortly. And of course, the information from providers and students is obviously specific to the context of the institution. Now, the main aim of the TEF is to incentivize improvement and enhancement. And the idea is that providers would want to achieve the highest rating they can, so that it incentivizes them to improve throughout before, during, and after the assessment in order to get the better rating next time. Now, the ratings also, we think, provide useful information to students. It's not the sole information. It's presented alongside more detailed information at course level, but it does give a sort of overall sense of quality they can expect. So that's a quick overview of the TEF, and we'll go into a bit more detail now and onto the proposals. If we could have the next slide, please. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Catherine.
Thanks, Graham. Hello, I'm Catherine. I'm one of the managers in the TEF team, and Jess and I are going to talk you through some of the key aspects of our proposals. To be clear, these are just proposals at this stage, what follows on these slides, and we're inviting your feedback on all of them. Could I have the next slide, please? So as you're probably aware, the key changes that we're proposing is that whereas in the past TEF was voluntary for smaller providers, in future we would assess and rate all OfS registered providers, and we do that on a rolling cyclical basis. As Graham explained, that's about extending the reach of the TEF, and it's aimed at ensuring students at all providers benefit from high quality and improvements to their experience and outcomes. We're expecting that the first assessment cycle will take about 3 or 4 years. And during that, we'd assess all registered providers that offer undergraduate courses. And then in the second cycle, we'd also assess those that offer taught postgraduate provision. And this reflects the provision that would be in scope in each cycle. Have the next slide, please. So in the first cycle, we're proposing to continue to focus on provision as the current TEF does, and that would include all courses that a provider has responsibility for. So, for example, courses that were offered under partnership arrangements or validation arrangements would be in scope of the assessment of both the lead and the delivery partner. We're consulting and asking whether we should incorporate apprenticeships, and this is because of Ofsted's role in this area, because we'd want to avoid any double regulation in this area. In the second cycle, we're proposing to extend to taught postgraduate provision and also to look at the experience and outcomes of those who are undertaking modular provision specifically. This is because it will take us some time to develop comparable data indicators for those areas. And this could include implementing an equivalent of the NSS for PGT students. At the moment, while there's potential for us to expand into other areas in future, we don't have any firm proposals for this, and we would consult on any further extensions in future. Have the next slide, please. So the proposals that we've developed seek to enable smaller providers to take part effectively in the TEF. These include simplifying the range of information that they'd need to submit by taking a different approach to the evidence used to assess student outcomes than in the last TEF. And I'll say more about that shortly. Varying the assessment approach where indicators for a provider are insufficient. And by that, we mean either we don't have the indicator data or there are high levels of statistical uncertainty around the data. Exploring alternatives to a written student submission. So, for example, commissioning so we can get direct student input in cases where it's not practical for students to make a submission. And also assessing most institutions without a current TEF rating later in the cycle. This would allow more time for those unfamiliar with the TEF to prepare. But we do recognise that some providers may wish to come in sooner, and we're interested in understanding the extent of that, so how many would want to be assessed earlier in the cycle. And finally, we need to recruit more assessors from small specialist or college-based providers. We recognise it can be difficult for those from smaller providers to give up the time, and we'd welcome thoughts on how we could enable them to in future. And we've also invited suggestions of other things we could do that would help smaller providers to take part effectively. Have the next slide, please. So in terms of what we're proposing to assess and the ratings, we're proposing to retain the two aspects or areas of assessment from the last TEF, so student experience and student outcomes, and to rate each of these using the same ratings, so gold, silver, bronze, and requires improvement. But our proposals involve aligning what is assessed under each of those aspects more closely with the relevant B conditions that Graham talked about, and aligning the ratings with our minimum quality requirements. So this means in future, bronze would mean meeting the minimum requirements, which is a change from in the past when it indicated high quality. Silver would be typically high quality, and gold would be typically outstanding quality. And to achieve those higher ratings, providers would need to demonstrate consistent levels of quality across all students, all subjects and all modes of provisions throughout each of the areas covered by the aspect. So consistency would be really important in getting silver and gold ratings. A provider would be rated requires improvement if the assessment included it didn't meet minimum requirements. We then go on to determine if there'd been a breach of condition B3 for student outcomes, but if the assessment raised concerns about quality of the student experience, so that the areas that relate to the more qualitative B conditions, then we think this would likely require further investigation and a visit to the provider. And finally, it's not represented here, but we're proposing to retain having an overall rating, but to take a rules-based approach to that and base it on the lowest aspect rating rather than involving consideration of criteria to get to an overall rating. Have the next slide, please. Right, so we're not proposing a lot of change to the student experience aspect other than aligning it with what's within the relevant B conditions and changing those rating descriptions. So we'd continue to consider evidence from providers, benchmark NSS indicators, which took account of providers' specific mix of students and subjects, and direct input from students. And that would either take the form of a student submission or the alternative that we discussed. So where there's insufficient NSS data for a provider, we're also proposing that we'd use an alternative method to collect student views, such as a focus group. And we've invited views again on what might be the most effective way to do that. And we'd be looking through that to capture feedback on those areas covered by the NSS. And all providers would receive a rating for the student experience. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some examples of the ratings criteria for the student experience and how those might differ across the different ratings. Assessors would triangulate the evidence that they had to judge which description best applied. And then when determining the aspect rating, they consider across the criteria whether the student experience was of sufficient quality, high quality, or outstanding quality. And as I've mentioned, how consistent that was across all of its students. We have included proposed criteria in the consultation, but it's very much an initial attempt at this, and we'd welcome feedback on it, including might be able to have greater differentiation across the ratings. Next slide, please. So the changes we're proposing to the student outcomes aspect are a bit more significant. So we're proposing to include consideration of whether a provider meets our minimum requirements for student outcomes and no longer carry out standalone assessments against condition B3. We're also proposing to simplify B3, so to only look at minimum numeric thresholds in the indicators for continuation and completion and not to set them for progression anymore. The way in which this will work is that a provider can only get a bronze rating if it meets those minimum thresholds or can justify why it doesn't. Otherwise, it will get a requires improvement rating. But obviously, we'd apply a materiality test to that to make that it was a material element of the provision where they didn't meet the threshold. For providers that meet thresholds, in deciding which rating to award, we're proposing to continue to use benchmarked progression, and we'd also use benchmark continuation and completion indicators, but introduce a wider set of benchmark post-study indicators. And we proposed two of those. One of them is a salary measure based on the Leo dataset, and another one is a measure based on responses to the graduate outcomes survey question about the extent to which the graduate is using what they've learned in their study in their current activity. Providers would be able to supply contextual information that relates to these indicators in their submissions, but not alternative evidence in the way that they were able to in the last TEF. And this is a more streamlined approach, which is intended to be significantly burdensome both for providers and for assessors, and to allow for greater comparability in what we're assessing. We do recognise that there are potential limitations to a more data-led approach, and benchmarking and consideration of context in assessments are therefore particularly important. Because of the broad approach we're proposing to take to student outcomes, with greater reliance on comparable data, where we don't have sufficient indicators, we're proposing not to rate providers for student outcomes. So not all providers would receive a student outcomes rating. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So just to recap, because I think this is particularly important for this audience, as they're most likely not to have sufficient data. We've set out in the consultation what we mean by sufficient data, and there's factors that we consider. Is the data available? Does it meet the kind of publication thresholds we have? Does it represent a significant proportion of the provider students? For example, the NSA data may not represent most of a provider's students, depending on the courses that they offer. And can we have a high degree of statistical confidence in it? Where there's insufficient data for NSS, as I've said, we'd still assess and rate the student experience aspect, and we would gather alternative feedback from students. But where there's insufficient student outcomes data for a provider, we wouldn't assess the student outcomes aspect. And if we do take this approach, we recognise the importance of any absence of rating appearing neutrally when we publish the ratings. Right. I think I'm handing over to Jess now. Right.
Hi. Yes, you are. Next slide, please. Thank you, Catherine. So I'm just going to carry on talking through some more of the detail. So looking at provider submissions, as Catherine's already covered, we expect the emphasis for this likely to be more on the sort of student experience aspect and the evidence provider wants to put forward for that. There might be some content you want to cover around student outcomes, but it would be, you know, that kind of contextual information we've talked about. So we wouldn't be asking for alternative data from you. We would likely sort of give a recommended broad structure. So as it says here, typically we find it helpful if a provider sets out their sort of own aims, their mission, characteristics of your own students, what evidence you're relying on, and so on. But one of the questions we ask in our proposals is there more we could do here to support you? Could we offer more detailed templates or, you know, any other support? In the last TEF, we had a page limit, which was 25 pages. And the idea behind a page limit is that it kind of directs the volume that we'd expect. So it avoids excessive content and burden on both providers and our assessors, but you know, is appropriate and doesn't unduly constrain you from the evidence you want to put forward. One question we're asking is could we reduce that further? There's quite a lot in our proposals that sort of focuses the information we expect from providers. So yeah, that might be one question that you'd like to feedback on. Next slide, please. And I think, again, as we flagged all the way through, the student element to our assessment and student involvement is really important to this whole process. We want to build on what we did last time. So we typically have a formal student submission as part of the evidence. That's usually coordinated by a nominated student contact at a provider. It's a way for the assessments to incorporate more direct evidence from the student body. We usually find it's really helpful to supplement the NSS information, so it might highlight specific issues of importance to your own groups of students. And also it might, you know, reflect the views of students that aren't covered by the NSS data. So, for example, students that are earlier on in their studies. This time round, we're proposing that student submission just covers student experience and not student outcomes, so only one of our two aspects. And that's in response basically to sort of feedback and evaluation we did of TEF 23, where student reps told us that it was quite difficult to put in a submission around student outcomes. We would issue guidance to you on how to approach that student submission, but we would expect providers to fully support their students in this area, whilst also ensuring obviously that it's as independent as it can be. And as Catherine was saying, we would encourage this kind of submission, but if that's not feasible, either because you feel your student representation structures are less well developed, or due to size or availability of student cohorts, that sort of thing, we want to explore are there alternative means that we can get that student voice in. So again, that's another question in our proposals. Next slide, please. So we have touched on some of these points already, but just to talk a bit about the assessment cycle. So it's a cyclical approach, but in comparison to the last TEF, it's over a longer period of time. So we envisage the first cycle would be over around 3 or 4 years. And that means we need to assess we need to prioritise who we would assess in the first year. We don't expect that a lot of providers that haven't participated previously would come in the first year. But if there are any of you listening that would be really keen to come in, as soon as possible, we'd be interested to hear from you. But otherwise, we expect most those assessments to sort of take part in years 2 or 3. And that's because we want to allow, as much time as possible for providers that haven't taken part before to prepare. And we do think it might improve the sort of reliability or availability of data for some. And then beyond that, after that first cycle, the frequency we think would depend on a couple of factors, so rating received and risk. So as it says here, we're proposing that the providers with the highest ratings would have longer gaps between assessments, and those with bronze or requires improvement, excuse me, would have shorter periods between assessments. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, because we want to sort of have greater scrutiny and greater attention where there's potential risk for students, but also we think those providers would probably be keen to come in and be reassessed more quickly if they feel they've addressed any issues from their previous assessment. Next slide, please. So Graham mentioned at the start that we want TEF to have more impact and to really focus on driving improvement for students. And that's led to our proposals around strengthened incentives around the ratings. And this is all with the idea that we are encouraging providers to aspire to the highest rating possible. So the proposal set out some potential sort of incentives or rewards for the highest ratings. So things like potential eligibility for funding streams, potential eligibility for different DAPs and so on. And it's all because, as I said, we want those stronger incentives to move above bronze. The approach we're proposing will also help us identify cases we want to look at more closely and perhaps through further quality assessment work. And that might happen if a provider received a bronze rating, but it would be more likely if you received requires improvement. Next slide, please. So we've talked a bit about the timeline, but just some headlines from this. As Graham said, this is a 2-stage sort of consultation period. So we're consulting at the moment, and that closes in December on the broad proposals. And then we plan to consult again autumn next year on further detail and guidance and so on. Our current timeline has our first assessments kicking off in summer 2027. But as we've said, it's unlikely we would be assessing any providers who haven't taken part before in that first tranche. This is our current sort of timeline that's in the consultation proposals. We will be looking at if we can do any of this more quickly, if we can streamline any of the development processes, and the idea would be we'd give updated information on the timeline in the second stage consultation. Next slide, please. So just to sum up some of the points we've raised today on implications if you're new to TEF, we think possibly some might be assessed in the first year, but it's more likely to be 2028 and 2029. In all cases, providers would be assessed for student experience, and we would expect a submission that works closely with the assessment criteria for this aspect. Providers likely will come in for student outcomes, but may not, depending on the sort of reliability. And if you are coming in for student outcomes, there is the option to supply sort of contextual information to explain your data. Students would be supported to put in a student submission, and if that's not feasible, we do want to look at alternative mechanisms for getting that student input. And I should say it is in our consultation proposals, but we think at the moment we'd be able to give a provider around 6 months notice before we start an assessment with them. Next slide, please. So as we go through this consultation period, we welcome your views on anything we've set out. We've just pulled out here a few questions that might be of particular relevance if you haven't taken part before, if you are a smaller provider. So there's some questions in the document around, how can we support new providers to engage effectively? What other support and guidance should we be considering? Any different templates? And a few questions around how we sort of improve the diversity of our assessor pool and get more participants from small and specialist and college-based education. And that's both for the academic and the student assessors. We're interested in that. And alternative ways of gathering evidence, either instead of a student submission or alongside instead of NSS data. And yes, and questions around the timeline and when new providers might come in. So yeah, these are questions you might particularly want to comment on, and that's perfectly okay on our sort of formal for feedback mechanisms. If you only want to comment on the areas that are of particular interest, that's fine to do so. Next slide, please. So I said at the start, this wasn't really a sort of feedback event, but we will be holding specific feedback events later in November. So please do come along if you're interested. We've got an in-person event on the 18th of November, and then we'll be holding another targeted webinar for providers new to TEF on the 20th of November. And we will also be coming to a lot of different sector and mission group meetings in the coming months. So yeah, you can use that events link to register for any events. And as I said at the start, if during a session we don't come to your question, or it's about an individual provider, then you can use that TEF address there to get in touch. Otherwise, I think that might be the end of our slides. Thank you. So we're going to turn to Q&A. Right. I'm just going to open our document where we're collating questions. I think we pre-submitted questions. It might be helpful to start with around including postgraduate students. So there was a question around, can you talk a bit more about the national postgraduate survey that might be developed? And I think I saw a question in the chat as well as on what do we mean by postgraduate taught, and might we expand postgraduate research in the future?
Thanks, Jess, and thanks everyone for questions coming in. So we are proposing that in the lead up to the second cycle, we develop some kind of a national postgraduate taught survey. And we've got some ideas set out in the document about how we would go about doing that. So developing a questionnaire in the first instance, then running some sort of a pilot and then rolling it out. And the idea is that the postgraduate student survey would be rolled out before the second cycle begins, so that there is data available on postgrads for the second cycle of assessments. There was also a question in there about the PTES. For those that don't know, it's the postgraduate taught. Is it taught experience survey? I think that's what it stands for. Anyway, it's a survey that is run by Advance HE that institutions can subscribe into. Now, that is an interesting one because a number of institutions do subscribe, and it provides a way of benchmarking postgraduate experience against others that take part. We're interested in the questionnaire, and I think as we develop a questionnaire, we'd look at that, we'd look at the National Student Survey, and we'd look at coming up with something that's sort of tailored specifically to taught postgraduates. And we are in discussion. Well, we'll have some more discussion with the Advance HE about that. But yeah, we're interested in views on this. I mean, do you think the PTES should be rolled out nationally, or developing another survey? You might have views on that. Postgraduate research, we're not proposing to include in the second cycle as yet. I think there would need to be further work and thinking about what could be assessed for postgraduate research. So that's something to look at further down the line.
Thanks, Graham. We've got a bit of a theme coming through around how we look at partnerships. So a few comments around, is there not sort of potential duplication of assessment if people have lots of different partners? Have we given consideration to the workload that might require? And how would TEF be represented in the outcomes for an institution with various partners?
Yeah, so I suppose the questions there relate, yes, obviously the number of providers that have multiple partnerships. And when we assess a provider, we would be looking at all of the undergraduate provision that it's involved in. So one of the things we're proposing, we mentioned earlier, is that all of the data we're proposing would be presented in kind of two batches of data. So all of the students taught by the institution, and then alongside that, all of the students taught through partnership arrangements with that institution. So it's all visible. The question then is, I suppose, how far do you need to involve your partners in preparing for a TEF submission? Because on the partnership side, obviously there is sort of joint responsibility. I think, yeah, we're interested in views around that. I mean, it was a feature in the last TEF, of course. Lots of institutions took part with multiple partnerships. I didn't get the sense that they were necessarily getting it involving a great deal of work with individual partners in doing that, because if you look at it from the sort of the validating partners view, or the contracting out partners point of view, they might have multiple partnerships, but their role in oversight of all of that provision, I would imagine they would be able to prepare a submission with enough information about how they're managing their partnerships through their day-to-day business, and without necessarily asking individual partners for a lot of extra information at the point of writing a submission. But yeah, but we're interested in views on that. And then from the teaching partners' point of view, if they've got multiple validators, yeah, there's a question about whether you need to involve each of the validating partners specifically when it comes to a TEF submission, when presumably you've got ongoing relationships with them.
Thank you. We had a bit of a headline question, which I'm sure would be of interest to everybody. It's kind of around, what do you see as the benefits for smaller providers having to participate in TEF? I guess there's a bit of a concern balancing that with the burden there might be in taking part first time.
Yeah, so obviously we are aware that there is burden involved in taking part, both for the institutions and for ourselves and for the assessors. So we have thought quite carefully about trying to design a scheme that keeps the burden to the minimum necessary. And you can see that reflected in a number of our proposals, for example, to try to streamline what needs to be covered in a submission, to focus much more on the student experience aspect, which is more sort of qualitative, and less information needed than previously around student outcomes, because we think that can be more reliant on benchmarked data. We also want to, in terms of reducing burden, less frequent assessments for those that are highest quality, and a more sort of risk-based targeted approach where the quality ratings are lower than they'd be assessed more frequently. So we're trying to keep overall the burden limited. For small providers, the benefits, well, I mean, we're really coming at this from the point of view of benefits to students primarily. So we think students at all providers should benefit from some external quality assessment to provide assurance that wherever they go, they're receiving high quality, and also that all providers that they're studying at are sort of incentivized to keep improving and enhancing quality. But having said all of that, we're very interested in your feedback and your views on, particularly, are there any ways we can streamline this and make keep the burden proportionate for smaller providers, and anything we can do to help enable effective participation.
Thank you. We've had a batch of questions come through around the student outcomes aspect. So we did have a question in advance actually about the shift from evidence to context only, and what's the OfS expecting here. And then a question around, can you say a bit more about the rating, what the rating might look like for those that don't meet the threshold for data to be assessed under student outcomes?
Yeah. Well, if I take the second one first, so because we're proposing that student outcomes can be assessed largely through a set of benchmarked indicators and use fairly factual indicators that are comparable across institutions, and benchmarked to take account of individual context, we think that's enough information. As I said, it's the kind of minimum necessary approach. It's enough information to derive ratings for student outcomes. We think that if that outcomes data, if there isn't enough outcomes data for an institution, what we're proposing is we just won't assess and just won't rate student outcomes for that institution. So that institution would only be rated for student experience, and the student experience rating would also become its overall rating. We did think about the alternative. The alternative is, if we don't have sufficient data, we would then have to ask the institution to provide its own alternative data about student outcomes. And that's, we learned from the last TEF, that where it becomes really burdensome for providers to do that if they don't have enough responses to the graduate outcomes survey or other data. How are they supposed to gather that information for themselves? It's quite burdensome, and then it's quite difficult for the panel to interpret data that may be collected in a completely different way with a different scope and so on. So that's why we're proposing that the least burdensome approach is just not to rate outcomes if the data isn't there. And then the question about what sort of contextual information would we be expecting? Again, what we're trying to avoid is the need for institutions to generate their own alternative evidence of student outcomes that isn't already collected through these national data sets. So we're not asking for alternative evidence of outcomes. What we're asking for is, if you think those national data sets are somehow not giving an accurate picture, and there might be various reasons for that, to provide the context to explain why this particular measure doesn't give an accurate picture for us, because, and the most obvious example we can think of, I'm sure many of you are aware, for the progression indicator, we know that jobs are classified according to the ONS classification system, and then are grouped into professional managerial or not. And we know there are some occupations that are not classified by ONS as professional managerial, but they may well be the occupations your students are intending to go into. So that's the kind of context you can tell us about that will then be taken account of in the assessment.
Probably a linked or a follow-up question. We had a comment that the metrics seem to emphasize outputs rather than outcomes, and question, how does that fit with the notion of quality that TEF is supposed to assess? Another linked question about why it's not looking at learning gain as much as it did last time.
Yeah, I think, well, I suppose to some extent I've kind of answered the question about learning gain, because it is something that which we started in the last TEF. We asked institutions to identify their own concepts of what kind of learning gain they expect their students to achieve. And then we said we'd expect institutions to start measuring that and providing measures in the following TEF. We discussed that quite a lot with sector groups, and there was quite mixed views about it. I think everyone can see there is value in doing that, but it's also a lot of work. It's a lot of burden to start developing new measures. And it's also, if every institution does it in their own way, it's also very hard to assess in a robust way. So on balance, we felt that actually the extra burden and the complexity of assessing it is not worth the benefit of us doing it in this process. I mean, there's nothing to stop institutions continuing that work, but it's just not worth the burden of requiring all institutions to go down that road and develop their own measures and try and assess it. In terms of outputs and outcomes, I'm not quite sorry, I haven't seen the question itself, but I think on student outcomes, I think we are focusing on outcomes. We are focusing on, do students complete their studies? Do they go on to some kind of job or other activity that they value afterwards? So I think we're focusing on outcomes under the outcomes aspect, and then on the experience side of it, it's you could think of it as, well, what's the quality of the experience and the nature of the curriculum and so on that can lead to those outcomes.
Thank you. And then probably, I think this might be our last one around student outcomes, but do we have a view on how student outcomes assessment within TEF reflects or relates to PSRB expectations?
That's an interesting question, and I think you could probably ask the same thing about experience as well. I think PSRB expectations are very varied. There are many different types of PSRBs that have different frameworks, and they look at different things when they accredit. So we have started some discussion with some PSRBs, and we're certainly open to more. And actually, we'd really welcome PSRBs contributing to this consultation. But it's very hard to design a framework in the way that we're trying to assess all providers against a sort of broad but single framework in a way that relates clearly to all PSRB requirements. They're just too varied, but we think they can work alongside each other. I mean, it depends which PSRBs you're working with. Yeah, we do have discussions with them. We share information, particularly if we've got concerns, or if a PSRB has concerns.
Thank you. We had I think this was a pre-submitted question actually around the future plans to sort of align with participation work, and a question about how we're intending to drive quality. Sorry, the document's moving around, so I can't read that. 2 seconds. I think it was around the idea that quality might move out of the quality of students with different characteristics might be focused more in TEF in the future versus how it is in A&P at the moment. So yeah, I think it was just a question about the future development of that.
Yes, so I mean, our proposals focus very much on how we integrate our different streams of quality assessment, the sort of the compliance assessments and then TEF assessments. But it does also raise the question about how far or should we integrate more our quality assessment activity with APPs, with access and participation plans. So we have sort of suggested that within the future TEF, because we are looking at experience and outcomes for different student groups, students with different characteristics are all sort of shown in the data sets that we look at. That the TEF can go quite a long way to looking at the equality of opportunity between different students' experience and outcomes. And therefore, do we need to also do all of that in APPs in future, or are there ways in reducing the duplication? So we're interested in your views on that. But the suggestion is that if TEF can do more of the sort of the P part, the participation part of Ps, then perhaps APPs in future could focus more on the A part, the access part, because TEF wouldn't look into access. But there would still remain some differences. So we invite views on that.
Thank you. Then we had one around apprenticeships and future Ofsted role. And do we think quality assessment of degree apprenticeships might come out of the Ofsted regime and into the OfS quality system?
That's a really interesting question, which I'd love to know the answer to myself. I mean, it's not I don't think it's something we can answer, but yeah, we are we do discuss these things with DfE and now with Skills England, but and Ofsted. But yeah, I don't know is the short answer. I think what we're interested in is the question of, if Ofsted continue assessing apprenticeships as they do, is there a role, or should there be a role for TEF in looking at part of it as well? And arguably Ofsted don't look so much at outcomes of apprenticeship students, and arguably there's a space for TEF to do that. But again, we're interested in views.
Thanks. We had a question around B3 and how will monitoring of progression metrics be managed between now and full implementation of the new integrated approach?
Yes, so I wonder this question might be meant to be more broad than just the progression metric itself. I suppose the question is, how will we monitor quality and I guess all of the student outcomes more broadly between now and the new system kicking in? The answer to that is that we do continue to monitor the data and other intelligence we receive in an ongoing basis, and that's always been part of what we do. But it's only where we have material concerns arising from that monitoring that we might then go and engage with the institution or potentially carry out a quality investigation. So it's very much on a targeted risk basis that monitoring would lead to us going in and engaging with the institution. And so that's essentially the first stream of assessment activity that I was talking to will continue until the new system starts.
We had one around the impact of the future approach and the rating. So have we modelled the impact of this across current TEF awards? So the consistency of outstanding across courses and students, etc., might lower the number of golds and increase the number of bronzes. And have we considered the impact this might have on perception, for example, for international student recruitment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think that I would agree that if we do go forward with the idea that gold needs to be consistently outstanding or silver needs to be consistently high quality, I think that does imply that there might be it might be harder to get gold or silver in future than it was in the last TEF. I think that is an implication. The question then is what are there, what are the consequences of that? I think from the reason we're making that proposal is because we think actually that's an effective way to drive improvement in institutions where there are areas of weaker performance. It gives a really strong incentive to actually focus in on improving those areas or improving for those particular student groups that may be getting lower outcomes, for example. So it's really trying to benefit students is where our proposal is coming from. But then, yes, would that have an impact on the reputation of the sector? internationally. I think that's a question we'd really welcome views on. We'd welcome evidence on that if that's possible. I mean, we have looked at the impact of TEF ratings so far on student perceptions. It's not clear that it has a huge impact at the moment internationally, but if you have views or evidence about that, we'd be interested.
Thank you. We had some practical questions around the assessment approach. So how long will each assessment take? And for example, number of weeks, and will there be opportunities during the assessment to speak to the assessors?
So what we are proposing is a process that's very similar to the last TEF, in that we would publish all of the data and launch the guidance, and then we'd select a group of providers each year. So for the first cycle, we're suggesting that in the summer we would launch the guidance and select and notify the first group of providers to be assessed. They would then have access to the data and the guidance, and would be given a deadline to make submissions, which would be about 6 months later. So those submissions come in about 6 months later, and then the assessors would carry out their assessments. We think that would again take about, give or take, 6 months to complete those assessments. We don't expect there will be discussion between the institution and the assessors, other than if the assessors are minded to award a lower rating, so a bronze or a requires improvement rating, then the provider would be given that as a provisional decision and given the opportunity to make representations and submit further information and etc. So there would be that iteration before final decisions made. We did think about whether there should be some other possible process for assessors to kind of raise questions if something isn't clear, or if there isn't enough information about something. I think there are pros and cons of doing that. It adds complexity and cost and time. And the question in our mind at the end of the day was, well, is it really necessary if there's that representations process at the end anyway?
Thank you. Still on kind of practicalities of assessment, I guess. Could we say a bit more about the criteria and what might drive a rating of high quality versus outstanding quality for gold? So what would be determining those kind of 2 levels of quality?
Yes, so we do in the consultation we've put out, we've included in there a kind of initial draft set of criteria for student experience. I think it's in an annex somewhere, can't remember which annex it is, but Catherine did show an example of that on the screen of one of the particular things. But if you have a look at all of them, what you can see is that the bronze criteria are really around what it says in the B conditions, so providing sufficient support for students, for example. And then as you go up to silver and gold, it kind of becomes more demanding, more sort of tailored to students' needs, more effective in delivering positive outcomes and so on. But those are just our initial thoughts. So we really do welcome feedback on that, and particularly on the question of, is there enough clarity of the difference between silver and gold, for example, is something we want to work with the sector to design that further and make it clear. On student outcomes, we've also suggested some criteria which are more about performance against benchmark. And I think because it's a more data-driven sort of set of criteria, it's actually, I think, more clear. What we're saying there is that silver essentially means being broadly on benchmark. Gold would be more about materially exceeding the benchmarks.
Thank you. We had a question around the assessment fee and proportionality for smaller providers. So have we given any consideration to sort of varying it depending on size?
That's an interesting question. We did have some discussions before we put out our proposals with various groups, and did float the question with some of the stakeholder groups about should there be a different type of process for the smaller providers that might not result in a full suite of ratings, but maybe more of a just sort of binary outcome if it's a much lighter touch process. The broad feedback we got was that, well, ideally all providers would receive the same sort of outcome and therefore go through broadly the same process. But what we have suggested is that for smaller providers in particular, often the data can be more limited. So we have focused our proposals on what do we do when the data is more limited, and I think Catherine explained that in the presentation.
Thank you. We've got some questions coming in on sort of things we did touch on already, but I'll go back through. So on the postgraduate taught survey proposals, would we be consulting on those as well? And do we have a view on timing for that?
Yes, I mean, so the idea is there would be consultation. I think we would also run a pilot. The timing, I think, is outlined in the consultation document, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, so I'm afraid I'll refer you to that.
Thank you. And then we've had a couple more questions come in around partnerships. And I think, a question around previously, the approach was sort of partner universities that have previously been TEF rated. The colleges that work with that partner, should come under that TEF rating on the basis that that partner has sufficient educational oversight. So have we thought that through when proposing that, all registered providers take part, and what might happen if a associated college or partner had a different TEF rating to their university partner?
Yeah, I mean, that is entirely possible, and we did see that in the last TEF. I think that there were some associated colleges that say got a gold rating because the teaching they were providing to their students was excellent. But the validating universities didn't get gold rating because as a university there's sort of more mixed performance across the range of what it was doing. So I think that's entirely reasonable conclusion to come to.
And I think we touched on this earlier, but a comment around the sort of multiple small partners providers might have. So are we saying that even if the validated partner submits a TEF as a registered OfS partner, then the partner institution sort of has to give information on all of their multiple partners, and the impact that the fact that there might be sort of lots of different sets of different student characteristics, and a bit of a comment around the cost implications of trying to cover all of that different partnerships. So hopefully I've represented that question correctly. Yeah, I think it might have been more of a comment, but
well, I mean, this is it's a very complex area because there are many partnerships, if you know what I mean, and also there are a number of, say, colleges that deliver some of their provision through partnership arrangements, and other provision is not through partnership arrangements. They might have, for example, their own foundation degree awarding powers, and they don't have a partnership, but for degree level maybe they do run through partnerships. And there are so many different permutations, which is why I think the only way to get a comprehensive view is to look at each institution and look at whatever it is that the institution does in higher education. I can't really see that we could cover off all provision only looking at it through the lens of, say, the validating partners, for example.
We do have just a few minutes left, so I think we might have time for one more question. We've been asked, are we considering any visits as part of the assessment?
Yeah, so that, again, a really interesting question. We'd had quite a lot of discussion about this with various groups in the lead up to the proposals. Again, many people felt that there could be benefits in visits, and indeed we could see benefits in visits because it does provide a sort of additional kind of direct experience, direct view of what's going on, helps with that. However, ultimately, the cost and the burden and the complexity of visiting all providers, given the scale, the volume that we're proposing to assess, we thought was ultimately prohibitive, or at least the cost outweighed that extra benefit. So we also think that the TEF broadly worked well last time around, and we can build on that through a desk-based approach. But we are suggesting, though, that because with desk-based assessments, there is the potential they might not be as accurate. So we are suggesting that we might go in and do some sample-based visits to test, essentially, to look at the accuracy of the outcomes from the desk-based approach.
Thank you. Probably just got time for one more. So we've set out that our evaluation has told us that TEF did drive improvement across the sector. Do we have a view on, well, it says generally, do we have a view on improvements that happened at providers that didn't participate in TEF, given there are a sizable proportion of providers that chose not to take part?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure we know is the short answer. We have just commissioned a long-term evaluation of our overall approach to quality regulation. So we have appointed independent consultants to look at that, and what they're going to be doing is in the coming months, actually, they're going to be taking a sort of a baseline of the impact of our quality regulation approach as it is currently. And in their work, they will be looking at the impact on providers that have taken part and those that haven't taken part in the TEF up to now, so we can get a better understanding of how does the current system impact on driving improvement and so on. And then it's a longitudinal study, so they'll go back in maybe a couple of years' time and even beyond, up to 6 years later, to look at how the new approach is hopefully having a greater impact.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for all of your questions. I think colleagues have been going through and answering them in the chat, so hopefully there's not a lot left unanswered. But again, if there's anything burning that you didn't get a chance to raise, do email us and we can get back to you. In terms of next steps, we will publish a video of this session and the slides on our website shortly. And as I said, there's quite a few other engagement sessions going on over the autumn. So I think between the team, we're going to most mission group and sector group sort of forum and network meetings in the next few weeks. And then we'll be holding another series of events in November, as I said, where if you might be submitting a formal response through your institution or your mission group, but if you wanted to come to a formal feedback session to give your thoughts directly, then you'd be very welcome. And we've got some online ones and an in-person one, so do take a look at our events page. Otherwise, I think I can wrap up and say thank you very much for coming along, and thank you to Graham and Catherine. Well, particular thank you to Graham for handling all of those very interesting questions.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.